What if I told you that everything you've been taught about solving your problems is actually making them worse? Right now, you're probably carrying at least 3 worries in your mind. Maybe it's that conversation at work that didn't go well, the relationship that feels strained, or the financial stress that keeps you awake at night. You've been told that caring more, trying harder, and controlling every detail will fix these problems. But here's the shocking truth. This approach is precisely why you feel more anxious today than you did 5 years ago. 2,500 years ago, a prince named Siddhartha had everything you think you want: unlimited wealth, perfect health, complete control over his environment, yet he was miserable. One day, he made a decision that kings and emperors called insane. He walked away from it all, and in that act of ultimate letting go, he discovered something that changed the course of human history. He found the secret to effortless living. Here's what will blow your mind. The Buddhist monks who followed his teachings didn't just find inner peace. They became the most productive, creative, and influential people of their time. They built civilizations, created art that still moves us today, and developed technologies that were centuries ahead of their time. All because they learned one counterintuitive principle: the less you try to control, the more control you actually have. In the next hour, I'm going to prove this to you through 10 ancient stories that read like your own life. Each story will show you exactly where you're bleeding energy trying to force outcomes that would happen naturally if you just stepped back. More importantly, you'll learn the specific Buddhist techniques that will make your biggest problems either disappear completely or become so easy to handle that you'll wonder why you ever struggled with them. But here's what I need you to understand. If you keep approaching life the way you're doing it now, 5 years from today you'll be exactly where you are right now, just more exhausted. The choice is yours. Ready to discover why the most powerful thing you can do is sometimes nothing at all. 400 years ago, deep in the mountains of Japan, 2 Zen monks named Tanzen and Aikido were walking the ancient pilgrimage route to Mount Fuji. They had been traveling for days through forests so thick that sunlight barely touched the ground, their wooden sandals clicking rhythmically on stone paths worn smooth by countless pilgrims before them. The monsoon rains had been particularly fierce that year. When they reached the Katsura River, they found the wooden bridge completely washed away. The water rushed violently downstream, carrying broken trees and debris from the mountainside. The current was so strong that even experienced swimmers would think twice before attempting to cross. On the opposite bank stood a young woman in an exquisite silk kimono, clearly from a wealthy merchant family. Her elaborate obi was decorated with golden threads that caught the filtered sunlight, and her hair was arranged in the complex style of unmarried nobility. She stood at the water's edge, staring helplessly at the churning rapids that separated her from her destination. Now, you must understand something crucial about these monks. They had taken sacred vows that governed every aspect of their lives. Among the most fundamental was the prohibition against physical contact with women. This wasn't merely a rule, it was a spiritual commitment that defined their path to enlightenment. Breaking such a vow could mean expulsion from the monastery and the loss of everything they had worked for. Tanzen looked at the woman's distress, then at the dangerous river, then back at his companion. Without a word, he approached the young woman. "Sister," he said gently, his voice carrying the calm authority of years spent in meditation, "this crossing is treacherous, but I can carry you safely to the other side." Before she could respond, and before Aikido could object, Tanzen knelt down and gestured for her to climb onto his back. The woman, grateful beyond words, carefully arranged her heavy silk robes and allowed the monk to lift her. Step by careful step, Tanzen entered the icy water. The current immediately tried to sweep them downstream, but his years of mountain walking had given him sure footing on slippery rocks. Halfway across, a particularly strong surge nearly knocked them both over, but Tenzin adjusted his balance and continued forward with the steady determination of someone completely present in the moment. When they reached the other side, he set her down gently on the muddy bank. She bowed deeply in the formal manner of her class, expressing gratitude that went beyond words. Then she hurried away down the mountain path, her expensive sandals clicking rapidly as she disappeared around a bend. The two monks resumed their journey in complete silence. Hours passed like this. They walked through valleys where cherry blossoms floated on the breeze like snow, past terraced rice fields that reflected the sky like mirrors, through small villages where temple bells marked the passage of time. The sun traced its arc across the heavens, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Still, they walked without speaking. As evening approached, and they could see the lights of their destination monastery twinkling in the distance, Aikido could no longer contain the storm that had been building inside him. His face flushed red with a mixture of anger, confusion, and righteous indignation. "Brother Tenzin," he burst out, his voice echoing off the mountain walls. "How could you do such a thing? Our sacred vows, our commitment to the Buddha. You touched that woman, you carried her in your arms. You violated everything we stand for. How could you betray our spiritual path so completely?" Tenzin stopped walking. He turned to face his companion, and those who knew him would have recognized the slight smile that appeared at the corners of his mouth, the expression of someone who had been waiting patiently for this exact moment. "My dear brother," he said, his voice carrying the gentle wisdom that comes from years of understanding the human heart. "I set that woman down at the river's edge hours ago, but I see that you are still carrying her." In that instant, Aikido felt something crack open inside his chest. Not his heart breaking, but his understanding expanding. He realized that while Tenzin had carried a woman across a river for perhaps 10 minutes, he had been carrying the weight of judgment, anger, and mental anguish for the entire day. This story reveals what Buddhist masters call the second arrow of suffering. The Buddha taught that when something painful or challenging happens, that's the first arrow and it's often unavoidable. But then we shoot ourselves with the second arrow through our resistance, our mental stories, our inability to let go of what has already passed. Tenzin experienced only the first arrow. He saw someone in need, he helped, the moment passed. Aikido shot himself with the second arrow repeatedly throughout the day. This shouldn't have happened. He broke the rules. What will others think? How can I travel with someone who acts this way? Each thought was another arrow, creating suffering that had nothing to do with the original event. In Zen Buddhism, this clinging to past events is called monkey mind, the way our thoughts swing from branch to branch of worry, never finding rest. The monkey in our minds grabs onto experiences, emotions, and judgments, refusing to let them pass naturally through our awareness like clouds passing through an empty sky. But here's what's remarkable about Tenzin's response. He demonstrates what Zen masters call no-mind, a state of spontaneous, natural action without attachment to outcomes. He saw someone who needed help. He helped. The moment passed completely. No second guessing, no worry about consequences, no mental replay of events. This is the first key to effortless living, learning to distinguish between necessary action and unnecessary attachment. We can care deeply and act with full commitment without carrying the weight of every experience forever. Think about your own life right now. How many rivers have you already crossed, yet you're still carrying the people, the judgments, the mistakes, the disappointments on your back? How much energy are you spending replaying conversations that are over, rehashing decisions that are done, worrying about opinions that have already been formed? The freedom that Tenzin possessed is available to you in this very moment. not through becoming cold or uncaring, but through learning to love fully without clinging, to act completely without attachment, to care deeply without carrying everything forever. But this raises a deeper question about why we cling in the first place. What is it about the human mind that makes us grab onto experiences and refuse to let them go? The answer to this question leads us to our next story, one that reveals the hidden trap that keeps even the most successful people imprisoned in their own achievements. In the golden age of the Tang dynasty, there lived an emperor named Wu Ming who possessed everything a mortal could desire. His palace stretched across 7 hills, with gardens so vast that it took a full day to walk from one end to the other. Peacocks wandered freely among fountains carved from jade, and libraries housed scrolls containing the wisdom of 1,000 generations. Yet every morning, Emperor Wu Ming would wake with a knot in his stomach and the same tormenting question: what will they remember about me when I am gone? This obsession had grown like a cancer over the years. Wu Ming employed 300 court historians whose sole purpose was to document his every word, every decision, every moment of apparent wisdom. He commissioned poets to compose epic verses about his benevolence, artists to paint portraits that would hang in temples for centuries, and musicians to write songs that children would sing long after his death. The more elaborate his monuments to himself became, the more anxious he grew. Were the historians capturing his true greatness? Were the poets eloquent enough? What if future emperors overshadowed his legacy? What if people forgot him entirely? He began checking his reputation obsessively. Every morning, he would summon his advisors for detailed reports on what people were saying about him in the markets, the villages, the distant provinces. He collected praise like a starving man hoards rice, but no amount ever satisfied his hunger. One autumn morning, as golden leaves swirled in the palace courtyards, a wandering Zen master named Huangbo arrived at the gates. Unlike other visitors who prostrated themselves and spoke in flowery court language, this monk simply stood quietly in the throne room, his hands folded peacefully, his eyes radiating a calm that seemed to fill the entire space. "Master," the emperor commanded from his ornate throne, "tell me what you see when you look upon your emperor. How will history remember Wu Ming the Great?" Huangbo gazed at the emperor for a long moment, taking in the elaborate golden robes, the jeweled crown, the desperate hunger in the royal eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was as gentle as morning mist. "Your Majesty, I see a man who has lost his shadow." The emperor leaned forward, confused. "What do you mean? My shadow follows me everywhere." "Look, you can see it right there on the marble floor. Does it?" Huangbo asked with infinite patience. "Or have you been so busy creating reflections of yourself in other people's minds that you've forgotten what casts those reflections in the first place?" Wu Ming felt his face flush with irritation. "Speak plainly, I am the Son of Heaven. My achievements will echo through eternity. My wisdom guides an entire empire." The Zen master's expression remained unchanged, like a mountain unmoved by wind. "Your Majesty, may I ask you something? When you sleep at night, where are your achievements? When you dream, where is your empire? When you were born, crying and helpless in your mother's arms, where was your wisdom?" The emperor opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. Something in the master's words had touched a place he had forgotten existed. "You see," Huangbo continued, "you have spent so much energy trying to create a permanent image of yourself that you've lost touch with the part of you that needs no image, no achievement, no validation. Before you became emperor, before you had a name, before you accomplished anything, that original essence was already complete and perfect." The emperor's voice rose to fill the vast throne room. "How dare you suggest that I am nothing without my accomplishments?" "I suggest the opposite," Huangbo replied with a slight smile. "I suggest that you are everything without them." Your accomplishments are like waves on the ocean, beautiful, constantly changing, but temporary. You have mistaken the waves for the ocean itself. That night, Emperor Wu Ming could not find sleep. He wandered through his palace, past golden statues of himself, past walls covered with his portraits, past rooms filled with chronicles of his reign. For the first time, instead of pride, these monuments filled him with a strange emptiness. He found himself in his private garden, sitting beside a lotus pond under the full moon. As he stared at his reflection in the still water, a gentle breeze disturbed the surface. His image scattered into thousands of ripples, breaking apart and reforming endlessly, never quite the same twice. In that moment, watching his reflection dance and dissolve, Wu Ming understood what the master had meant. He had been desperately trying to make his reflection in other people's minds permanent, solid, unchanging. But reflections, by their very nature, are temporary. They depend entirely on the surface that holds them and the light that creates them. The next morning, he summoned Huangbo again. This time, the emperor came without his ceremonial robes, without his crown, dressed simply in the plain silk that servants wore. "Master," he said quietly, "I have been trying to build a monument to myself out of other people's opinions. But last night, watching my reflection scatter and reform in the pond, I realized something. The moon doesn't struggle to make its reflection permanent in the water. It simply shines, and the reflection appears naturally. When the water is disturbed, the moon doesn't suffer, it continues shining just the same." Huangbo nodded with the satisfaction of a teacher whose student has grasped a profound truth. "Now you begin to understand what we call your original face, the essence of who you are before you put on any mask, before you achieved anything, before you became concerned with how others see you." This story illuminates one of the most liberating discoveries in all of Buddhism: the difference between our essential nature and our constructed identity. Emperor Wu Ming had fallen into what Buddhist psychology calls ego-grasping, the exhausting attempt to create a solid, permanent sense of self through external achievements and validation. In Zen temples, there's a famous teaching question: "Show me your original face before your mother and father were born." This isn't asking for a literal answer. It's pointing to the part of you that exists independent of your history, your accomplishments, your roles, or your reputation. When we constantly seek validation and worry about our image, we become like the emperor, desperately trying to make our reflection in other people's minds permanent and perfect. But reflections, by their very nature, are temporary and constantly changing. The more energy we pour into controlling them, the more anxious and exhausted we become. The freedom comes when we realize what Wu Ming discovered by the lotus pond. Our true worth doesn't depend on these reflections at all. Like the moon in the master's metaphor, we can simply be ourselves authentically and let others' perceptions be what they are, temporary images that have nothing to do with our essential completeness. Right now, think about the reflections you're trying to control in other people's minds. How much mental energy are you spending trying to manage what others think of you? How often do you check your own reputation, your social media, your professional standing, hoping to find confirmation of your worth? The emperor's transformation reveals something crucial. When we stop trying to control our image, we don't become less than we were. We become free to discover who we actually are beneath all the performing and proving. But this raises an even deeper question. If our constant seeking of validation is so clearly exhausting, why do we keep doing it? What drives this endless hunger for more recognition, more security, more proof of our worth? To understand this, we need to explore one of Buddhism's most profound insights about the nature of desire itself. High in the Himalayan mountains of Tibet, where the air is so thin that every breath requires intention, there lived a monk named Lobsang who was revered throughout 3 provinces. For 25 years, he had served as abbot of Tashil Hunpo Monastery, one of the most prosperous and influential spiritual centers in all of Tibet. Lobsang had built his reputation carefully, methodically. Under his leadership, the monastery had grown from a simple collection of meditation huts into a magnificent complex that housed over 800 monks. The main temple, with its golden roof that caught the first rays of dawn, could be seen from villages 30 miles away. Pilgrims would travel for months just to receive teachings in its hallowed halls. The monastery's wealth was legendary. Precious statues brought from India lined the corridors, their jeweled eyes seeming to watch visitors with ancient wisdom. The library contained manuscripts so rare that scholars from distant universities would spend years waiting for permission to study them. The temple bells, cast from bronze mixed with gold dust, created sounds so pure that people claimed they could heal broken hearts. But Lobsang's greatest pride was his reputation as the perfect spiritual leader. Every morning, he would walk through his domain with the measured steps of someone conscious of being watched. The gardens must be immaculate, with not a single fallen leaf out of place. The prayer flags must hang at precisely the right angles. The offerings in the shrines must be arranged with mathematical perfection. He told himself this attention to detail was devotion to the Buddha, but in the deepest part of his heart, he knew the truth. He was addicted to being seen as flawless, to being the abbot that other abbots envied, to having built something that would outlast his lifetime. One winter morning, as Lobsang stood on his balcony surveying his perfect kingdom, the mountain above the monastery let out a sound like the world splitting open. An avalanche of unprecedented size came thundering down the slope, carrying with it centuries of accumulated snow, rock, and ice. In less than 10 minutes, everything Lobsang had spent his life building was buried under 20 feet of debris. The golden temple, the precious statues, the irreplaceable manuscripts, the famous bells, all of it vanished as if it had never existed. Worse yet, the avalanche had blocked all the mountain passes, cutting them off completely from the outside world, with winter food supplies nearly exhausted. Lobsang stood in the wreckage of his life's work, holding nothing but his simple wooden begging bowl, the same bowl he had carried as a young novice decades earlier. Around him, the surviving monks looked to him for guidance, their faces reflecting the same shock and despair he felt in his bones. For the first time in 25 years, Abbot Lobsang had nothing to manage, nothing to perfect, nothing to protect. His reputation as the ideal spiritual leader meant nothing to the avalanche. His carefully cultivated image could not feed the hungry monks who now depended on him. With snow beginning to fall again, Lobsang took his empty bowl and began walking to the nearest village, a settlement so poor that its inhabitants barely survived each winter themselves. At the first house, he knocked and held out his bowl. The elderly woman who answered took one look at this once proud abbot, now humbled and asking for help, and her face hardened with years of resentment. "Where was your Buddha when the mountain fell?" she demanded before slamming the door. At the second house, a farmer laughed bitterly. "What good are your fancy prayers now, monk? My own children go to bed hungry. You should have learned a trade instead of living off our donations." House after house, door after door, some offered small handfuls of barley from their meager stores, moved by basic human compassion. Others turned him away with words that cut deeper than the mountain wind. By evening, Lobsang's bowl contained only enough food to give each surviving monk a few mouthfuls. As he sat by a small fire that night, surrounded by his hungry brothers, something extraordinary happened. Instead of the crushing despair he expected to feel, Lobsang experienced something he hadn't felt in decades: profound, inexplicable peace. For the first time since becoming abbot, he wasn't worried about maintaining appearances, managing resources, or protecting his status. All of that was gone. What remained was simply this moment, the warmth of the small fire, genuine concern for his fellow monks, the taste of simple barley, the sound of wind through the ruins. One of his younger monks, seeing the serene expression on Lobsang's face despite their dire circumstances, asked in wonder, "Master, we have lost everything. How can you be at peace?" Lobsang held up his empty wooden bowl, and in the flickering firelight, his eyes sparkled with an understanding that seemed to illuminate his entire face. "My dear student," he said, "for 25 years, I believed this bowl was supposed to be permanently full. I spent all my energy trying to fill it with achievements, reputation, security, and status. I thought the purpose of the bowl was to hold things forever. But tonight, I finally understand what the Buddha meant when he taught about emptiness." He paused, looking around at the faces of his fellow monks, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time. This bowl was never meant to be permanently full. Its purpose is not to hoard things, but to be available empty and ready for whatever this moment offers. When it's empty, it can receive anything. When we try to keep it permanently full, it becomes useless. The young monk looked confused. "But Master, don't we need food, shelter, security?" "Of course," Lobsang replied, demonstrating with his bowl by tilting it toward the fire so the light passed through it completely. "But we don't need to cling to them. Look, when the bowl is empty, light can shine through it. When we try to hoard and hold onto everything, we become like a bowl packed with stones. Nothing new can enter, and no light can pass through our lives." Over the following months, something miraculous occurred. The destroyed monastery became a place of pilgrimage, not for its former grandeur, but for the profound teachings that emerged from its ruins. Lobsang, no longer concerned with maintaining appearances or protecting possessions, became a channel for wisdom that seemed to flow directly from his experience of losing everything. Travelers would arrive expecting to find a broken man, but instead they encountered someone who radiated a joy and freedom they had never witnessed. The teaching that emerged from Lobsang's transformation spread throughout Tibet and became known as the wisdom of the empty bowl. This story embodies one of Buddhism's most challenging yet liberating concepts, the teaching of sunyata or emptiness. But this isn't the emptiness of despair or nihilism. It's the emptiness of infinite possibility, of complete availability to life as it actually is. In Zen Buddhism, there's a saying, "The pine teaches silence, the rock teaches stillness, but the empty bowl teaches receptivity." When we cling to possessions, status, achievements, or even our spiritual accomplishments, we become like Lobsang's monastery before the avalanche, impressive perhaps, but rigid and vulnerable to destruction. But when we learn to hold everything lightly, like Lobsang with his empty bowl after the avalanche, we discover something remarkable. We can enjoy everything without being owned by anything. We can care deeply without being crushed when circumstances change. We can love without the desperate fear of loss. The Buddha's teaching on the Four Noble Truths tells us that suffering comes from tanha, literally meaning thirst or craving. This isn't just craving for pleasurable things, but the deeper thirst to make permanent what is inherently impermanent, to fill our bowl once and for all so we never have to face uncertainty again. But Lobsang's transformation shows us that liberation isn't about having nothing. It's about holding everything with an open hand. When his bowl was literally empty, his heart became infinitely spacious. When he stopped trying to fill the container of his life permanently, life began to flow through him with natural abundance. Think about your own life right now. What are you trying to keep permanently in your bowl? What achievements, relationships, or securities are you gripping so tightly that you've forgotten the joy of simply being open to whatever comes next? The empty bowl doesn't remain empty by accident. It requires a fundamental shift in how we relate to desire itself, not the elimination of wanting, but a completely different understanding of what true satisfaction actually means. And this brings us to a story that reveals how even the wealthiest among us can discover they've been living as prisoners in golden cages of their own making. In the bustling port city of ancient Guangzhou, where silk roads met sea routes and fortunes were made with single transactions, there lived a merchant named Chen Wai who had achieved what most people only dream of. His trading empire stretched from the spice markets of Ceylon to the pearl divers of the South China Sea. His warehouses overflowed with treasures that kings would envy: ivory from distant Africa, jade from the northern mountains, and bolts of silk so fine they seemed woven from moonlight itself. Chen Wai's mansion occupied an entire city block, with courtyards within courtyards, each more magnificent than the last. His servants numbered in the hundreds. His concubines were chosen from the most beautiful women in 7 provinces, and his dinner table could seat 50 guests beneath ceilings painted with scenes of celestial paradise. Yet every night, as Chen Wai lay on his bed of carved rosewood inlaid with mother of pearl, he could not sleep. His mind raced with endless calculations: which ships had returned safely? Had the monsoon damaged his cargo? Were his competitors undercutting his prices? What new ventures should he pursue to stay ahead? Each success only multiplied his anxieties. When he acquired his first warehouse, he worried about filling it. When he filled it, he worried about acquiring a second. When he owned a dozen warehouses, he worried about protecting them all. Every possession became something that possessed him in return. The more he accumulated, the more vulnerable he felt. His wealth had become like a magnificent palace built on a foundation of quicksand. The higher it rose, the more precarious it became. He employed armies of guards to protect his properties, battalions of accountants to track his investments, and networks of spies to monitor his competitors. His success had transformed him into a prisoner of his own achievements. One day, while inspecting a shipment of rare herbs from Tibet, Chen Wai noticed an unusual figure among the dock workers. An old monk in simple gray robes was helping unload cargo with the easy grace of someone completely at peace with physical labor. What struck Chen Wai wasn't the monk's presence. Monks often worked for food, but his expression of genuine contentment as he performed this humble task. During a break, Chen Wai approached the monk, driven by a curiosity he couldn't name. "Venerable sir," he said, "I've been watching you work. You seem remarkably happy for someone with no possessions." The monk, whose name was Yunmen, looked up with eyes that sparkled with quiet humor. "How do you know I have no possessions?" Chen Wai gestured at the monk's simple robes and bare feet. "It's obvious you own nothing of value." Yunmen smiled. "Ah, but you're mistaken. I own everything I need, and I need everything I own. Can you say the same?" Chen Wai felt a flash of irritation. "I own ships, warehouses, properties across 3 provinces. My wealth could buy this entire district." And yet, Yunmen observed gently, "You look like a man who hasn't slept peacefully in years. Tell me, do you own your possessions, or do they own you?" The question hit Chen Wai like a physical blow. He found himself telling this stranger about the sleepless nights, the constant anxiety, the way every acquisition seemed to multiply his problems rather than solve them. Yunmen listened with the patience of someone who had heard this story countless times. When Chen Wai finished, the monk picked up 2 lengths of rope from the dock. He tied one around his own wrist loosely, so it could slide freely. The other he wrapped tightly around a wooden post, binding it securely. "Look," he said, pointing to his own wrist. "This rope connects me to the post, but I remain free to move. Now look at this other rope. It also connects to the post, but what has happened?" Chen Wai saw immediately. The rope bound tightly to the post had no freedom of movement at all. Yunmen nodded. Your possessions are like these ropes. You can be connected to them lightly, enjoying them when they're present, letting them go when they must go, or you can bind yourself to them so tightly that you lose all freedom. The choice is always yours. But without security, without accumulating wealth, how can I be safe? Chen Wai asked. Yunmen untied the rope from his wrist and let it fall to the ground. Tell me, do you see that bird? He pointed to a seagull soaring overhead. Does it carry a warehouse on its back for security? Does it hoard food for the next decade? Yet it finds what it needs each day. Which of you seems more free? That night, for the first time in years, Chen Wai sat quietly in his garden without reviewing ledgers or planning new ventures. He simply watched the moon reflect in his ornamental pond and listened to the sound of wind through bamboo. Gradually, a strange realization dawned on him. All his accumulating and protecting and worrying had been an attempt to purchase something that couldn't be bought, the feeling of being safe and complete. But as he sat in stillness, he noticed something remarkable. Without all the mental noise of managing his empire, a natural sense of completeness began to emerge. Not the frantic satisfaction of acquiring something new, but a deep contentment that seemed to arise from simply being alive in this moment. Over the following months, Chen Wai began what he came to call his great simplification. He didn't abandon his business, but he changed his relationship to it entirely. Instead of expanding frantically, he stabilized at a size he could manage peacefully. Instead of hoarding profits, he began giving generously to causes that brought him genuine joy. Most remarkably, as his grip on his possessions loosened, his business actually became more profitable. Freed from the anxiety of protecting everything, he could see opportunities more clearly and make decisions from wisdom rather than fear. Chen Wai's transformation illustrates what Buddhist teachers call the paradox of attachment. The very things we cling to for security become the source of our insecurity. The possessions we accumulate to feel safe become prisons that trap us in cycles of endless acquisition and protection. In Buddhist psychology, this is understood as the second type of suffering, the suffering that comes from trying to find permanent satisfaction through impermanent things. Every pleasure fades, every possession eventually breaks or is lost, every achievement becomes yesterday's news. Yet we keep reaching for the next thing, convinced that this time it will be different. The Buddha taught that this cycle is like drinking salt water to quench thirst. The more we drink, the thirstier we become. Each desire fulfilled creates two new desires. Each possession acquired creates new anxieties about protecting it. Each level of success achieved reveals new levels we haven't reached yet. But Chen Wai's story shows us the alternative. When we learn to hold our possessions lightly connected, but not bound, we can enjoy abundance without being enslaved by it. We can care for our responsibilities without being consumed by them. We can appreciate what we have without living in fear of losing it. Think about your own golden chains right now. What possessions, achievements, or securities are you gripping so tightly that they've begun to grip you back? Where in your life has the pursuit of more become a prison disguised as progress? The merchant's discovery points to something even more profound about human nature. Our deepest suffering often comes not from external circumstances, but from our reactions to those circumstances. And this insight leads us to explore one of Buddhism's most practical teachings, the incredible power that emerges when we learn to stop reacting to every provocation life offers us. In the ancient kingdom of Silla, during Korea's golden age of Buddhism, there lived a Zen master named Seonchial, whose reputation for wisdom had spread across the entire peninsula. Students would journey for months to study at his mountain temple, hoping to receive transmission of the profound insights that had made him legendary among the monastics of his time. What made Master Xianqiao unique wasn't his eloquent teachings or his vast knowledge of sutras. It was something far more mysterious: his complete immunity to provocation. No insult could ruffle him, no crisis could shake his composure, no emergency could disturb his fundamental equanimity. He moved through chaos like a mountain moves through storms, present, aware, but utterly unmoved. One autumn day, a young monk named Jinwu arrived at the temple carrying a heavy burden of anger and frustration. He had been expelled from 3 monasteries for his explosive temper and inability to control his reactions. His previous masters had given up on him, declaring him unsuitable for the spiritual life. Master Xianqiao accepted Jinwu without question, but he gave him an unusual assignment. Instead of meditation or sutra study, he was to follow the master everywhere and simply observe, not speak, not ask questions, just watch. The first test came within days. A wealthy patron who had donated generously to the temple arrived in a fury. His business rival had spread rumors that he was supporting Buddhist monks instead of Confucian scholars, damaging his political standing. He stormed into the master's chamber, his face red with rage. "You have ruined me," he screamed at Xianqiao. "Your greed for donations has cost me everything. I should never have trusted these foreign Buddhist teachings." Jinwu watched, expecting the master to defend himself, to explain the misunderstanding, or at least to show some emotional response to such accusations. Instead, Xianqiao simply continued preparing tea, his movements as fluid and peaceful as if he were alone in the room. The patron's anger escalated. He knocked over a precious vase, scattered sacred texts across the floor, and even raised his hand as if to strike the master. Through it all, Xianqiao remained serene, occasionally nodding with what seemed like genuine compassion for the man's obvious suffering. Finally, exhausted by his own fury, the patron collapsed into a chair. In the sudden silence, Xianqiao offered him a cup of perfectly prepared tea. The warmth and kindness in this simple gesture broke something open in the angry man. He began to weep, apologizing not just for his outburst, but for years of misdirected rage that had poisoned his relationships and his peace of mind. Later that evening, Jinwu could contain his curiosity no longer. "Master," he whispered, "how did you remain so calm? If someone had spoken to me that way, I would have been furious for days." Xianqiao looked at his student with gentle eyes. "Tell me, Jinwu, when someone throws a stone into a lake, does the lake become angry at the stone?" "No, master, but..." "And when the stone sinks to the bottom, does the lake hold a grudge against it?" "No, but that's different. The lake isn't a person." Xianqiao smiled, but what if it could be? Over the following months, Jinwu witnessed dozens of similar situations. Government officials would arrive demanding that the temple pay higher taxes, testing the master's patience with bureaucratic harassment. Fellow monks would sometimes criticize Xianqiao's unconventional teaching methods, challenging his authority in front of students. Bandits once threatened the temple, demanding gold that the monastery didn't possess. In every case, the master's response was the same: complete presence without reactivity. He didn't ignore what was happening, he was fully aware and engaged. But he never allowed external circumstances to disturb his inner equilibrium. He was like space itself, everything could move through it, but nothing could stain it or move it from its essential nature. The most profound test came during a harsh winter when food supplies ran dangerously low. A neighboring monastery's abbot arrived and publicly accused Xianqiao of hoarding rice while other communities starved. The accusation was not only false, but deeply hurtful, as Xianqiao had actually been sharing the temple's meager supplies with anyone in need. Jinwu felt his own anger rising on behalf of his teacher. Surely, this injustice demanded a response. But Xianqiao simply bowed to the accusing abbot and said, "If you believe we have extra rice, please take whatever you need for your community." That night, as they sat by a small fire with even smaller bowls of thin gruel, Jinwu finally understood what his master had been teaching through example. "Master," he said, "I see now what you meant about the lake. You don't react because you understand something I've been missing." Xianqiao nodded encouragingly. "What do you see?" "When I react with anger to someone's harsh words, I'm not defending myself, I'm letting them control my inner state. I'm giving them the power to disturb my peace. But when you remain calm, you keep your power within yourself." "Good," the master replied, "but there's something even deeper. When you react with anger to anger, what do you create in the world? More anger," Jinwu realized. "And when you meet anger with peace, the possibility of transformation," Jinwu whispered, understanding flooding through him like sunrise over mountains. "Exactly. Every moment we choose what we add to the world. Reaction multiplies whatever energy is thrown at us. Response transforms it." This story reveals one of Buddhism's most practical and powerful teachings, the difference between reacting and responding. When we react, we become like a mirror, simply reflecting back whatever energy is directed at us. Anger meets anger, frustration meets frustration, chaos meets chaos. We become prisoners of other people's emotional states. But when we respond rather than react, we become like Master Xianqiao's lake, present and aware, but not disturbed by what passes through our awareness. We maintain what Buddhists call equanimity, the inner balance that allows us to engage fully with life without being knocked off center by every wind that blows. In Buddhist psychology, this is understood as one of the most advanced spiritual practices. It's not about suppressing emotions or becoming passive. It's about developing such a strong center that external circumstances cannot shake your fundamental peace. You become like a mountain. Storms may rage around you, but your essential nature remains unmoved. Think about your own patterns of reactivity. How much energy do you lose each day by immediately responding to every trigger, every criticism, every inconvenience with immediate emotional reaction? How often do you let other people's moods determine your own inner state? Jinwu's transformation shows us that there's another way. When we stop reacting to everything, we don't become less engaged with life, we become more skillfully engaged. We start responding from wisdom rather than impulse, from strength rather than weakness, from choice rather than compulsion. But this raises a crucial question. If reactions are so clearly counterproductive, why do we keep falling into these patterns? What is it about the human mind that makes us resist the very flow of life that would carry us to peace? The answer lies in understanding one of Buddhism's deepest insights about the nature of acceptance itself. In a remote valley of ancient China, where terraced rice fields climbed the mountainsides like green staircases to heaven, there lived a farmer named Lai Bao, whose response to life's events had become legendary throughout the region. Unlike his neighbors, who celebrated wildly during good times and despaired during hardships, Lai Bao met every circumstance with the same 3 words: "We shall see." This wasn't the response of someone who didn't care. Lai Bao worked his fields with meticulous attention, tended his animals with genuine love, and cared for his family with deep devotion. But he had learned something that most people spend their entire lives resisting: the futility of fighting against the natural flow of existence. The story that made Lai Bao famous began during the spring of his 60th year. His only son, Wai Ming, had just turned 18 and was the pride of the entire village. Strong, intelligent, and kind-hearted, Wai Ming could plow a field faster than men twice his age and had been accepted to study at the Imperial Academy in the capital, an honor that came to perhaps one village boy in a generation. One morning, As Wai Ming was breaking a wild horse that had been captured in the mountains, the animal bucked violently and threw him to the ground. The young man's leg was shattered so severely that the village doctor declared he would never walk properly again, let alone work the fields or pursue his studies at the academy. The villagers gathered around Lai Bao's house, offering condolences for this terrible tragedy that had destroyed his son's future. They expected to find the farmer devastated, perhaps raging against the unfairness of fate. Instead, Lai Bao received them calmly and simply said, "We shall see." The neighbors were puzzled by his response. How could he be so indifferent to his son's suffering? Some whispered that the old farmer had lost his mind from grief. Others suggested he didn't truly love his son, but Lai Bao continued tending his fields and caring for Wai Ming with the same steady attention he gave to everything in his life. 3 months later, war erupted between neighboring kingdoms. Imperial conscription officers swept through every village, taking every able-bodied young man to serve in the emperor's army. They examined Wai Ming, saw his twisted leg, and pronounced him unfit for military service. As the other village boys marched away to uncertain fates in distant battles, Wai Ming remained safely at home. Now the villagers came to congratulate Lai Bao on his good fortune. Surely the gods had blessed him by protecting his son from the horrors of war through what had seemed like a tragedy. But Lai Bao's response remained unchanged. "We shall see." During the following year, as reports filtered back of devastating defeats and thousands of young soldiers killed or captured, the villagers' respect for Lai Bao's wisdom grew. But the farmer himself seemed untouched by either their previous pity or their current admiration. He continued his daily routines with the same equanimity he had always shown. Then Wai Ming, unable to pursue his original dreams, but gifted with abundant time during his recovery, began studying the medicinal herbs that grew wild in the mountain forests. His enforced stillness had awakened a natural talent for healing that might never have emerged if he had followed his planned path. Within 2 years, he had become the most skilled herbalist in 3 provinces, with people traveling great distances to seek his treatments. Once again, the villagers gathered to praise Lai Bao's prescient wisdom. Surely he had known all along that his son's accident would lead to this greater destiny. But the old farmer's response never varied. "We shall see." One day, a traveling Zen monk named Master Dongyang heard about Lai Bao's reputation and visited the farm to understand the source of such extraordinary equanimity. He found the farmer transplanting rice seedlings in the early morning mist, working with the same careful attention he brought to everything. "Honored farmer," the monk said, "the people speak of your wisdom in accepting whatever life brings. What teaching do you follow that gives you such peace?" Lai Bao straightened up, his weathered hands still holding the delicate green shoots. "Master, I follow no special teaching. I simply noticed something that most people seem to miss." The monk waited with the patience of someone accustomed to profound simplicity. "Life is like this river that flows past my fields," Lai Bao continued, gesturing toward the stream that irrigated his terraces. "I can stand in it and try to push the water backward, or I can work with its current. Either way, the river continues flowing. But one approach exhausts me while the other gives me energy to plant rice." "But surely," the monk pressed gently, "you have preferences. You must want good things for your family." "Of course I have preferences," Lai Bao smiled. "I prefer health to sickness, abundance to scarcity, peace to conflict. But I've learned the difference between preferences and attachments. Preferences are light, they guide my actions, but don't disturb my peace when things unfold differently. Attachments are heavy, they make me suffer whenever life doesn't match my expectations." The monk nodded with growing understanding. "So when you say we shall see, you're not being indifferent?" "No," Lai Bao replied, returning to his work. I'm being available to respond skillfully to whatever actually happens, rather than wasting energy fighting what has already happened or demanding that the future unfold according to my limited understanding. This conversation, witnessed by several villagers, revealed the profound wisdom behind Lai Bao's seemingly simple response. He had discovered what Buddhist masters call the middle way, neither clinging desperately to desired outcomes nor falling into fatalistic passivity, but maintaining what they term engaged acceptance. In Buddhist teaching, this represents one of the most sophisticated understandings of how to live skillfully. The farmer had learned to distinguish between two completely different relationships with reality: resistance and acceptance. Resistance creates suffering by demanding that life conform to our expectations. Acceptance creates peace by working harmoniously with life as it actually unfolds. This doesn't mean becoming passive or indifferent. Lai Bao worked diligently, loved deeply, and made careful decisions. But he held all outcomes lightly, understanding that his limited perspective couldn't possibly comprehend the vast interconnectedness of causes and conditions that shape every moment. The Buddha taught that suffering arises from our resistance to impermanence, our desperate attempt to make permanent what is inherently temporary, to control what is inherently beyond our control. Lai Bao had discovered the alternative, flowing with impermanence rather than fighting against it. Think about your own relationship with unexpected events. How much energy do you spend fighting circumstances that have already occurred? How often do you exhaust yourself resisting changes that are already underway? How frequently do you miss opportunities hidden within apparent setbacks because you're too busy insisting that things should be different? Lai Bao's wisdom shows us that there's another way to move through life, not as a warrior battling against reality, but as a skilled sailor working with winds that we cannot control but can learn to navigate. When we stop resisting the flow of existence, we don't become victims of circumstance. We become dancers with the natural rhythm of change itself. But this acceptance reveals something even more profound about human nature. When we stop fighting external circumstances, we often discover that what we were really seeking was never dependent on those circumstances in the first place. And this realization leads us to perhaps the most liberating discovery in all of Buddhist teaching. In the ancient city of Benares, where the sacred Ganges flows like liquid gold in the morning light, there lived a beggar named Ananda, whose story would challenge everything people believed about wealth, poverty, and the nature of contentment itself. Ananda had been born into one of the city's wealthiest merchant families. His father owned fleets of ships that carried precious cargo between India and distant lands, and their mansion was renowned for its beautiful gardens and collections of rare artwork. As a young man, Ananda had wanted for nothing the finest clothes, the best education, servants attending to his every need. But despite all this luxury, Ananda felt hollow inside, as if he were living someone else's life. He would wake each morning in his silk-draped bed feeling empty, go to sleep each night surrounded by treasures, yet somehow starving. The more possessions his family acquired, the more restless he became. Success felt like a beautiful prison he couldn't escape. At 25, in an act that scandalized the entire merchant community, Ananda gave away his inheritance, left his family's mansion, and began living as a wandering beggar. He owned nothing but the simple brown robe on his back and a wooden bowl for receiving alms. His family was mortified. His former friends declared him insane. The servants whispered that grief had driven the young master mad. But Ananda felt something he had never experienced in his life of luxury, a strange sense of lightness, as if enormous weights had been lifted from his shoulders. For 3 years, he wandered the streets of Benares, sleeping in doorways, eating whatever food kind strangers might offer, owning nothing and apparently having nothing. The city's actual poor regarded him with suspicion. What kind of beggar chose this life? The wealthy crossed the street to avoid him, embarrassed by his presence and perhaps secretly threatened by what his choice implied about their own lives. One monsoon morning, as rain poured through the streets turning dust into flowing mud, Ananda took shelter under the same temple archway as Mahavira, an old beggar who had lived on these streets for decades. Mahavira was dying. Anyone could see it in his labored breathing and the way his body seemed to be slowly disappearing into itself. As they sat together watching the rain, Mahavira turned to Ananda with eyes that held both curiosity and something resembling envy. "Young man," he wheezed, "I've watched you for 3 years. You beg like the rest of us, sleep on the ground like the rest of us, own nothing like the rest of us. But you're different. Even in this miserable life you seem content. How is this possible?" Ananda looked at the dying man with genuine compassion. "Old friend," he said gently, "may I ask you something? In all your years of begging, what have you been hoping to find?" Mahavira's answer came immediately. "Enough. Enough food so I'm not always hungry. Enough coins so I'm not always desperate. Enough shelter so I'm not always cold. Just enough to stop suffering." "And in all these years," Ananda asked quietly, "have you found enough?" The old beggar's laugh turned into a cough. "Never. There's never enough. Even on the rare days when my bowl is full, I worry about tomorrow. Even when I find a warm place to sleep, I know I'll have to leave in the morning. The hunger is always there, not just in my belly, but in my heart." Ananda nodded with understanding. "My friend, I used to feel that same hunger. But I felt it when I had rooms full of food, when I had boxes full of gold, when I had servants ensuring I would never lack for anything. The hunger wasn't in my circumstances, it was in my relationship to my circumstances." Mahavira looked confused. "What do you mean?" "Listen carefully," Ananda said, shifting closer so the old man could hear over the rain. "When I lived in my family's mansion, I was a beggar too. I was constantly begging life to give me more pleasure, more security, more recognition, more certainty about tomorrow. I was never satisfied because I believed satisfaction came from getting things rather than from letting go of the need to get things." "But you have nothing now," Mahavira protested weakly. "Do I?" Ananda asked with a smile that seemed to illuminate his entire face. "I have this moment of shelter from the rain. I have this conversation with you. I have the sound of water flowing in the gutters and the smell of earth being washed clean. I have breath in my lungs and awareness in my mind. How is this nothing?" The old beggar stared at him. "But tomorrow you might be hungry again. And tomorrow I might find food," Ananda replied. "But right now, in this moment, I'm not hungry. The suffering comes from living in tomorrow instead of living in now." Mahavira fell silent, and in that silence something shifted in his understanding. After a long pause, he whispered, "So you're saying the poverty was never in having no possessions. It was in feeling incomplete no matter what I possessed," Ananda confirmed. "The wealth was never in having many possessions, it was in recognizing the completeness that exists right here, right now, regardless of circumstances." That conversation under the temple archway became famous throughout Benares, not because anyone witnessed it, but because of what happened to Mahavira afterward. In his final weeks of life, something fundamental changed in the old beggar. People began to notice that despite his physical deterioration, he radiated a peace they had never seen in him before. He stopped grasping desperately at every offered coin and began sharing whatever food he received with other beggars who seemed hungrier. When Mahavira died, Ananda performed the funeral rites with the tenderness of a son caring for a beloved father. And in that act of love, the watching crowd saw something that challenged their understanding of wealth itself. Here was a man who owned nothing yet seemed to possess everything that truly mattered. This story illuminates what Buddhist teaching calls Buddha nature, the recognition that our essential completeness doesn't depend on external circumstances. The beggar who was already rich had discovered what the Buddha realized under the Bodhi tree. The peace we seek through acquisition is already present within us, waiting to be recognized rather than achieved. In Buddhist psychology, this is understood as the difference between conditional happiness and unconditional well-being. Conditional happiness depends on getting what we want and avoiding what we don't want. It's fragile, temporary, and exhausting to maintain. Unconditional well-being arises from recognizing that our fundamental nature is already whole, already complete, already free. Ananda's journey from mansion to street corner wasn't about rejecting material comfort. It was about discovering that contentment isn't produced by external conditions. Whether surrounded by luxury or owning nothing, the capacity for peace exists within our own awareness, independent of circumstances. Think about your own relationship with enough. How much of your mental energy is spent seeking security, accumulating achievements, or trying to feel complete through external means? What would shift in your experience if you discovered that the satisfaction you're seeking was already present, hidden not by your circumstances, but by your search for it? The beggar's discovery points to something even more radical. If our essential nature is already complete, then what we often call problems might actually be invitations to recognize this completeness. And this insight leads us to explore how we can protect and nurture this recognition in a world that constantly tries to convince us we're lacking something essential. High in the Himalayas, where the air is so pure that every breath feels like a blessing, there stood a monastery called Gyatso Ling, the Ocean of Enlightenment. At its entrance sat a massive wooden gate carved with protective deities, their fierce expressions warning away those who might disturb the sacred practices within. For 30 years, this gate had been guarded by a monk named Tenzin Norbu, whose responsibility was to determine who could enter the monastery and who must be turned away. This wasn't merely a matter of security, it was a sacred duty that required the deepest wisdom, for the wrong kind of energy could disrupt the meditation of hundreds of monks and corrupt the spiritual atmosphere that had taken centuries to cultivate. In his early years as gatekeeper, Tenzin had been generous to a fault. He opened the doors to every pilgrim, every seeker, every person who claimed to need spiritual guidance. Merchants came seeking blessings for their ventures, politicians came hoping to gain religious credibility, tourists came out of curiosity, and entertainers came looking for wealthy patrons among the monastery's donors. The result was chaos. The meditation halls buzzed with whispered conversations about business deals. The library became a meeting place for political discussions. The sacred courtyards filled with people more interested in taking photographs than participating in prayers. The monks found it increasingly difficult to maintain the deep states of contemplation that were the monastery's primary purpose. Tenzin began to suffer from what he later described as the disease of unlimited availability. He felt obligated to listen to every story, solve every problem, and accommodate every request. Visitors would keep him at the gate for hours, pouring out their troubles, demanding his attention, insisting that their needs were urgent and special. By evening, Tenzin would be so depleted that he could barely participate in the monastery's evening prayers. His own meditation practice withered as his mind became cluttered with other people's dramas, anxieties, and demands. He was becoming like a well that everyone drew from but no one replenished. One winter morning, after a particularly difficult week of managing demanding visitors, Tenzin collapsed at his post. The monastery's physician diagnosed him with complete exhaustion, not just physical, but spiritual depletion. His abbot, a wise old lama named Lobsang Tenzin, came to visit him as he recovered. "My devoted guardian," the abbot said gently, "you have forgotten something essential about the nature of gates." Tenzin looked up from his bed, confused. "Rinpoche, I have tried to be welcoming to all beings, as the Buddha taught." The abbot smiled with the patience of someone who had learned this lesson decades earlier. "Tell me, what is the purpose of a gate? To allow people to enter," Tenzin replied immediately. "Is that all?" the abbot asked. "If a gate only opened and never closed, would it still be a gate, or would it simply be an empty doorway?" Tenzin felt something shift in his understanding, like a door opening in his mind. "A gate," the abbot continued, "serves its sacred function precisely because it can both open and close. It protects what is precious by choosing carefully what it allows inside. The monastery is like a human heart. It must be generous, but it must also be discerning. Love without boundaries becomes meaningless kindness that helps no one." Over the following months, as Tenzin recovered his strength, he began to understand what the abbot meant. He started studying the patterns of different visitors, learning to sense their true intentions and the quality of energy they carried. Some people arrived with genuine spiritual hunger and respect for the sacred space. Others came with agendas that had nothing to do with spiritual practice. When Tenzin returned to his post at the gate, his approach had completely transformed. He became like the carved deities on the gate itself, fierce in his protection of the sacred, compassionate in his discernment. To sincere seekers, he was more welcoming than ever, offering profound guidance and opening doors to transformative experiences. But to those who came with inappropriate motivations, he became an immovable mountain. A wealthy merchant who had previously used the monastery as a venue for entertaining business clients found himself politely but firmly turned away. A group of tourists who wanted to photograph the sacred statues for their social media accounts were redirected to the public viewing areas outside the main temple. A politician seeking a photo opportunity with the revered lamas was told that such meetings required months of preparation and genuine commitment to study. Some people became angry when denied entry. They accused Tenzin of being unwelcoming, of betraying Buddhist principles of universal compassion. But the monk had learned to distinguish between pleasing everyone and serving what was truly beneficial. The transformation was remarkable. The monastery's spiritual atmosphere deepened profoundly. Monks found their meditation practices flourishing in the protected environment. Genuine seekers received far better guidance because Tenzin could give them his full attention rather than being scattered among dozens of casual visitors. Most surprisingly, Tenzin himself became more genuinely helpful to everyone he encountered. When his energy wasn't being drained by inappropriate demands, he had abundant compassion and wisdom to offer those who truly needed it. One day, a young monk asked him, "Tenzin-la, how do you decide who enters and who doesn't? What is your criteria?" Tenzin smiled and pointed to a bird perched on the monastery wall. "Watch that bird," he said. "Does it land on every branch it sees? Or does it choose carefully where to place its energy?" The young monk observed the bird selecting only the strongest branches, the ones that could support its weight and offer the best view of food sources below. "That bird understands something crucial," Tenzin continued. "Discrimination isn't the opposite of compassion, it's compassion's partner. When we say yes to everything, we dilute our ability to say yes meaningfully to anything. When we protect our energy carefully, we can offer it more generously where it will truly serve." This story reveals one of Buddhism's most misunderstood teachings, the importance of what we might call sacred boundaries. In a culture that often confuses unlimited availability with spiritual virtue, Tenzin's transformation shows us that true compassion sometimes requires saying no. The Buddha himself modeled this principle. He didn't try to teach everyone who approached him. He carefully assessed their readiness and sincerity. He withdrew regularly into solitude to maintain his spiritual strength. He established clear guidelines for monastic communities, protecting the conditions necessary for deep practice. In Buddhist psychology, this is understood as right mindfulness extended to our attention and energy management. Just as we wouldn't put any food into our bodies without consideration, we shouldn't allow any energy into our minds and hearts without discernment. Think about your own gates, the boundaries around your time, attention, and emotional availability. Are you practicing unlimited availability that leaves you depleted and less able to help anyone effectively? Or are you learning to be selectively generous in ways that protect your capacity to serve what truly matters? Tenzin's wisdom shows us that protecting our inner sanctuary isn't selfish, it's essential for maintaining the spiritual resources needed to be genuinely beneficial to others. But this raises an even deeper question. If we're not meant to be available to everything, how do we know what deserves our precious attention? The answer lies in understanding one of Buddhism's most profound insights about the nature of time itself. Along the dusty roads of medieval India, where ancient trade routes connected sacred cities like pearls on an invisible string, there walked a pilgrim named Dharamdev, whose story would become a cautionary tale whispered in monasteries across the subcontinent. Dharamdev had begun his spiritual journey with pure intentions. At 30 years old, feeling empty despite a successful career as a court scribe, he had left his comfortable life to seek enlightenment. He had heard stories of great masters who had found perfect peace, and he was determined to find such a teacher who could transform his restless mind into a fountain of wisdom. His first destination was Bodh Gaya, where the Buddha himself had attained enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. Dharamdev walked for 3 months to reach this holiest of places, his heart filled with anticipation. Surely here, at the very spot where the greatest awakening in human history had occurred, he would find the peace he sought. But when he arrived at Bodh Gaya, something felt incomplete. Yes, the place was sacred, yes, he felt moved by its history, but the profound transformation he expected didn't occur. Perhaps, he reasoned, he needed to study with living masters, not just visit historical sites. He had heard of a great sage named Ramananda who taught in Varanasi, renowned for guiding students to direct realization of truth. Dharamdev set off immediately, walking for 2 months through monsoon rains and scorching heat. When he finally reached Varanasi and sat before the revered teacher, Ramananda shared profound teachings about the nature of consciousness and the illusion of separation. The words were beautiful, even transformative in moments, but after 3 months of study, Dharamdev still felt fundamentally unchanged. The same restlessness gnawed at him, the same sense of incompleteness. Perhaps this teacher wasn't advanced enough, he thought. He had heard whispers of an even greater master named Kabir who lived as a simple weaver but possessed unprecedented spiritual insight. And so began a pattern that would consume the next 15 years of Dharamdev's life. From Kabir, he went to study with Nanak in Punjab, convinced that this great teacher held the final key. From Nanak, he traveled to Kerala to sit with Narayana Guru, certain that this master's approach would finally unlock his awakening. From there to Tamil Nadu to learn from Aranagiri, then to Bengal to study with Chaitanya, then to Rajasthan to receive initiation from yet another renowned sage. Each teacher offered genuine wisdom. Each teaching contained elements of profound truth. Each place held sacred energy that touched something deep within him. but always. After the initial inspiration faded, the same familiar feeling returned. This isn't quite it. The real teaching, the final answer, must be somewhere else, with someone else, in some other place. Dharamdev became a connoisseur of spiritual experiences. He could speak eloquently about different meditation techniques, compare various philosophical approaches, and recite teachings from dozens of traditions. Fellow seekers often sought his advice, impressed by his vast knowledge and extensive travels. But knowledge had become his prison. The more he learned, the more convinced he became that he still didn't know enough. One evening, as Dharamdev sat by a roadside fire planning his next pilgrimage, he had heard of an enlightened woman saint in the Himalayas. An old sadhu named Vimalananda approached and asked to share the warmth. This sadhu owned nothing but a tattered orange cloth and a wooden water pot. Yet he radiated a contentment that was unmistakable. As they sat together in comfortable silence, Vimalananda eventually asked, "Brother, you have the bearing of a serious seeker. How long have you been on the spiritual path?" 15 years, Dharamdev replied with a mixture of pride and exhaustion. "I have studied with the greatest teachers, visited the most sacred places, learned the deepest teachings. Yet somehow I feel further from peace than when I began." Vimalananda poked the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the dark sky. "Tell me, where are you going next?" Dharamdev described his plans to journey north, his excitement about meeting this new teacher who surely held the missing piece of his spiritual puzzle. The old sadhu listened patiently, then asked a simple question that would haunt Dharamdev for the rest of his life. "My friend, in all your travels seeking the perfect teacher, the perfect place, the perfect teaching, have you ever arrived?" The question hit Dharamdev like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" Vimalananda's eyes sparkled with gentle humor. "I mean, have you ever experienced the arrival you've been seeking? Have you ever reached that moment when you could say, 'Now I have found it. Now I can stop searching and simply be'?" Dharamdev opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. The truth was devastating in its simplicity. He had never allowed himself to arrive anywhere. Every experience, every teaching, every moment of insight had been immediately compared to some imagined perfection that lay always just ahead, always in the next place, with the next teacher. "But surely," Dharamdev protested, "spiritual growth requires seeking, learning, progressing toward greater understanding." "Of course," Vimalananda agreed. "But tell me, does a bird flying to its nest spend the entire journey looking for a better nest? Or does it eventually land in the one it has?" The old sadhu leaned forward, his voice becoming almost a whisper. "Brother, what if the peace you've been seeking in future arrivals is actually only available in present presence? What if enlightenment isn't a destination you reach someday, but a recognition that happens right here, right now?" That night, as Vimalananda slept peacefully beside the dying fire, Dharamdev lay awake, wrestling with a terrible and wonderful possibility. What if he had been carrying his destination with him all along, missing it only because he was always looking ahead to somewhere else? The next morning, instead of continuing north toward his planned pilgrimage, Dharamdev sat down beside the road and simply stayed still. For the first time in 15 years, he wasn't going anywhere. For the first time since beginning his spiritual journey, he allowed himself to be exactly where he was. In that stopping, something extraordinary happened. Not the dramatic enlightenment experience he had imagined, but something far more subtle and far more profound. The simple recognition that the awareness seeking peace was itself already peaceful. The consciousness looking for completion was already complete. The heart longing for home had never actually left home. Dharamdev's story illustrates one of Buddhism's most crucial insights: the difference between the spiritual path and spiritual seeking. The path involves sincere practice, study, and inner development. But seeking can become a sophisticated form of avoiding the present moment, always reaching for a future state of perfection that prevents us from recognizing the completeness available right now. The Buddha himself spent years as a seeker, studying with various teachers and practicing extreme austerities. But his actual awakening came not through finding something new, but through stopping his seeking and recognizing what had always been present. He called this recognition the cessation of becoming, the end of the endless project of trying to become someone other than who we already are. In Buddhist psychology, this is understood as the difference between horizontal and vertical spirituality. Horizontal spirituality moves through time, accumulating experiences, knowledge, and achievements. Vertical spirituality drops into the depth of this moment, discovering that what we seek in time is actually timeless. Think about your own relationship with spiritual or personal growth. How much energy do you spend looking ahead to future versions of yourself that will finally be happy, peaceful, or complete? How often do you defer contentment until you achieve the next level of understanding, success, or inner development? Dharamdev's transformation shows us that there's another way, the radical act of arriving where we already are, not as a final destination, but as the only place where real transformation ever actually happens. But this discovery reveals something even more challenging if present moment awareness is so obviously fulfilling. Why do we resist it so persistently? The final chapter of our journey explores this question. In the remote mountains of ancient Tibet, where the silence is so profound that you can hear your own heartbeat echoing off the peaks, there lived a monk named Thubten whose story began not with enlightenment, but with the deepest kind of human suffering. Thubten had entered monastic life at the age of 12, not from spiritual calling, but from tragedy. His entire family had perished in an avalanche that destroyed their village, leaving him as the sole survivor buried for 3 days under frozen debris. When rescue teams finally found him, his body was broken and his mind shattered by trauma that seemed to define the very core of his being. For the next 20 years, Thubten lived as what his fellow monks quietly called the Wounded One. He performed his duties faithfully, attended prayers regularly, and studied the sacred texts with scholarly precision. But beneath his monastic exterior, he carried his suffering like a second skeleton, an internal structure of pain that seemed to hold him upright even as it crushed him slowly from within. Every morning, Thubten would wake with the same familiar weight in his chest, the same images flooding his mind of that terrible day when everything he loved was swept away. He had constructed his entire identity around this tragedy. He was the monk who had suffered unbearably, the survivor who carried unimaginable loss, the victim of forces beyond his control. His pain had become his most prized possession, proof of his depth, evidence of his capacity to endure, validation of his right to be treated with special care and understanding. The other monks, well-meaning in their compassion, reinforced this identity. They spoke to him in gentler tones, excused him from difficult tasks, and treated him as someone whose suffering made him both tragic and somehow spiritually significant. Thubten had become addicted to being seen as broken, because it was the only way he knew how to receive love and attention. One spring day, an elderly lama named Rinchen Dorje arrived at the monastery. Unlike most visiting teachers who came with great fanfare, this lama appeared almost invisible, a small, unremarkable man whose presence you might easily overlook. But there was something in his eyes that seemed to see through all pretense, all performance, all carefully maintained identities. During his first teaching, Rinchen Dorje made a statement that shocked the assembled monks. The greatest suffering comes not from what happens to us, but from our refusal to let what happened to us be finished with us. After the teaching, Thubten approached the Lama privately, his voice tight with emotion. Rinpoche, you don't understand. Some pain is too deep to let go. Some wounds never heal. Some losses are so profound that they become part of who we are. Rinchen Dorje looked at him with eyes that held infinite compassion but no pity. My son, show me this pain you carry. Point to it. Where exactly does it lie? Thubten gestured to his chest, his mind, his entire body. It's everywhere, Rinpoche. It is me. Ah, the Lama said gently, but if it is you, then who is the one who observes this pain? Who is aware of carrying it? The question hit Thubten like lightning, illuminating a landscape he had never seen before. For the first time in 20 years, he noticed that there was an awareness that watched his suffering, an awareness that remained untouched by the pain it observed. Over the following weeks, Rinchen Dorje worked with Thubten using an approach that seemed almost cruel in its directness. Instead of comforting him or validating his suffering, the Lama consistently pointed to the consciousness that was aware of the suffering. You say, I am in pain, the Lama would observe. But notice there is the pain and there is the I that experiences pain. They are not the same thing. The pain comes and goes, changes in intensity, sometimes disappears completely when you sleep. But the I that is aware of pain, does that ever change? Gradually, Thubten began to recognize something extraordinary. The awareness that witnessed his pain was itself completely uninjured. It was like space itself. Trauma could move through it, but space remained unstained. Emotions could arise within it, but the awareness itself was never emotional. Memories could appear in it, but the awareness had no memory. It was eternally fresh, eternally present. The breakthrough came during a meditation retreat when Thubten suddenly realized he had been carrying his suffering like a precious relic, afraid that letting it go would somehow dishonor those he had lost or diminish the significance of what he had endured. He had been holding onto pain not because he couldn't release it, but because he had confused his pain with his identity, his suffering with his worth. In that moment of recognition, something inside him simply opened, not through struggle or effort, but through the gentle recognition that he was not his story. He was the awareness in which all stories appeared and disappeared. The transformation was remarkable. Thubten didn't become cold or indifferent to his past. Instead, he developed a compassion for his younger self that was deeper than any self-pity he had ever felt. He could acknowledge the reality of what had happened without needing to carry it as a burden forever. His fellow monks noticed the change immediately. The heaviness that had surrounded him for decades simply evaporated. He began to radiate a joy that seemed to have no particular cause, not the happiness that comes from getting what you want, but the contentment that comes from no longer needing anything to be different than it is. When other monks asked him what had changed, Thubten would smile and say, I discovered that I am not the phoenix that dies and is reborn from its ashes. I am the sky in which the phoenix flies. The sky is never burned, never destroyed, never needs to be reborn. It simply is. This story reveals Buddhism's most radical teaching about suffering. We are not obligated to carry our pain forever. The Buddha's own journey began with the recognition that suffering, while universal, is not our permanent identity. We can acknowledge what has happened without making it who we are. In Buddhist psychology, this is understood as the difference between pain and suffering. Pain is inevitable, it's the natural response to difficult circumstances. But suffering is optional, it's what we add to pain through our resistance, our stories, and our identification with our wounds. Thubten's liberation shows us that healing doesn't require forgetting or minimizing what happened. It requires recognizing that our deepest identity, the awareness that witnesses all experiences, is itself untouchable by any experience. When we rest in this recognition, we can respond to life's challenges from wholeness rather than woundedness. Think about the suffering you've been carrying as identity. What pain have you been holding onto because you fear that letting it go would somehow diminish its significance or your own depth? What if healing doesn't require becoming someone new, but simply recognizing who you already are beneath all your stories? The phoenix of liberation isn't about rising from ashes, it's about discovering that you were never the ashes in the first place. As our journey through these ancient stories comes to an end, you might notice something remarkable. The peace you've been seeking was never missing. It was simply hidden beneath layers of unnecessary struggle, like the sun hidden behind clouds that seem solid but are actually made of mist. Each story we've explored points to the same liberating truth. Life becomes effortless not when we control everything, but when we learn to flow with what cannot be controlled while taking wise action where we can make a difference. The two monks showed us that clinging to experiences creates suffering. The emperor discovered that our worth doesn't depend on others' opinions. The abbot learned that holding things lightly allows life to flow freely. The merchant found that possessions can possess us. The Zen master demonstrated the power of non-reactivity. The farmer revealed that resistance multiplies suffering. The beggar realized he was already complete. The gatekeeper learned that boundaries serve love. The pilgrim discovered that arrival happens now, not someday. And the wounded monk found that we are not our stories, we are the awareness in which all stories appear. The Buddha's promise remains as true today as it was 500 years ago. When you stop clinging to what cannot be held, you discover what can never be lost. Your journey toward effortless living begins the moment you stop fighting the river and start flowing with it. The current was always carrying you home.